everybody. I just want to let you guys know we're running a little bit behind, so it's going to be 5 minutes and then we'll get started, okay?
Okay. Well, good afternoon. Thanks everybody for being here. And we're going to start, the event, basically the presentation of the book, Why Does Latin America Matter? I think for all of us, we know the answer, but I think the Elcano Institute did a great job, basically, in trying to explain where Latin America is today, what are the advantages and the possibilities that Latin America presents for itself, but also for the world in the current complex geopolitical and economic context, and also how does the rest of the world, and in this case, especially Europe, can help Latin America help itself in basically launching an important decade of growth, prosperity, and inclusion. So let me thank Jose Juan, Ernesto Talvi, and Carlos Malamud, the authors of the report made by the Elcano Institute, one of the main think tanks in Spain, and congratulate them for a great report dealing with Latin America's current situation and more importantly with Latin American prospects, challenges, and opportunities. I think I will skip remarks about the report because we will have, two very important panels that go. The first one focus on the economics, and the second one of the political challenges facing Latin America. And maybe I would say a word of the importance that represents, the focus that Europe and the US should put on Latin America. And as I said before, how the US and Europe can help themselves, but also help Latin America help itself to really launch a decade of prosperity. I think in the current world in which, geopolitical tensions is one of the main forces driving both political and economic policy decisions, leading to a fragmentation of the world economy. Latin America can actually provide many solutions for Europe and for the US in the redesign of global value chains, in climate change policy, in energy transition, etc. But this will need that Europe and the US also changes their mind frame and really work in a much more aggressive way to solve their domestic political issues, to be ready to be a partner with Latin America in this process. Obviously, in the case of Europe, the EU-Mercosur free trade agreement is, I think, the most important policy that we can see in the near future to be part of this platform. And I think also the US should be much more dynamic in mobilizing financial resources and also trade facilitation for Latin America to be an even more important partner for the region. It is my pleasure to welcome to Georgetown and to welcome to this fora the new ambassador of Spain to the US, Ambassador Ángeles Moreno, who just arrived 10 days ago. And I think, at least in her official capacity, is the first time that she visits campus. So please let me give her our warmest welcome. And then we will move on with the program with Jose Juan to give some introductory remarks, and then we will move on to the panel. So, Ambassador, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here as Ambassador of Spain in my first academic event. Last year, as Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs, I had the opportunity to share also the policies of the government of Spain in a meeting here at Georgetown University. But it is especially a pleasure, dear Alejandro Werner, to attend the meeting that you organized together with the Real Instituto Elcano, because I used to be a member of the board of the Real Instituto Elcano until 2 months ago, when I stopped being the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and I became ambassador to the US. And in this position, I'm happy to accompany Jose Juan Ruiz, Charles Powell, and the rest of the team here today in the presentation of this key report and in the visualization that the administration and think tanks need to keep on working together to nurture each other's capacities and capabilities to think and act. It is essential to discuss on Latin America. Latin America matters, definitely. It matters to Spain. This is something that we've always known. And I think that fortunately our partners in Europe are more aware than ever now. And indeed, it matters to Spain, it matters to the US, and it matters to Europe also. And the European Union members have discovered these after COVID, and especially after the Russian aggression on Ukraine, when we had to start reaching out to like-minded countries, and those countries are to be found mainly in Latin America, apart from the usual group of Western security partners in NATO and in security alliances. This is something that Spain wanted to make very clear when we were president of the Council of the European Union last semester. And that's the reason why we organized a summit between the European Union and the CELAC. After 8 years of absence. During 8 years, there was no meeting at all. And during our presidency, we had this big political meeting at the level of heads of state and government, but we also had meetings at economic levels. Our vice president for economy met her counterparts in Latin America and in the European Union to try to find ways to push for more investments in infrastructures in Latin America, in new fields of in new economic fields like digital, or the renewable energies. Elcano's report is a report that we in Spain celebrated very much. I had the occasion to attend the first presentation with His Majesty the King of Spain and the Prime Minister of Spain, and it is very useful in debunking preconceptions and prejudices. So we will be able during these two sessions to understand which prejudices are dismantled. And that is very important for our political action. It's very important that governments have these information in order to act in consequence. To Spain, Latin America matters. Politically, it matters for many reasons, and it has mattered for many years. It matters because it is composed by, in general, by democracies, where the rule of law is generally respected, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and this is why many Spanish government agencies and foundations have been working to support these democracies and their governance. And I think of IFID, the Spanish Agency for Cooperation to Development, or the Foundation FIAP, which works with Latin American administrations in particular, or the Fundación Carolina, which is also very focused on Latin America and which has also worked a lot on supporting the renovation of the frameworks of government judiciaries, fiscal agencies, or security forces in those countries. This is also the reason why we were very happy from the government of Spain to join the Summit for Democracies of President Biden. And therefore, we were also very happy to lead the cohort on democracy in Latin America. And this proves that Latin American countries are in general democracies, and we have to count on them to defend our values, our common values, which we share with Latin American countries, as with the US and all European partners. And it matters also because our civil societies are very connected. Universities, think tanks, NGOs are very connected. In the cultural scene, they are also very connected. And economically, we are also very connected, and it is a key region for Spain, where our companies have been evolving and developing their activities for many, many years until they started opening their views to other third markets. But Latin America was our first point of concentration for Spanish companies. We share a language. Spain and Latin American countries share a language. It's a family. It's an identity somehow. Those who have lived in Latin America, this is my case. I lived in Mexico. I lived in Panama. We feel really at home when we're in Latin America, and we feel that we have this identity as we feel the European identity. So this is why we are convinced that Latin America matters, and Latin America matters also to the United States. It matters very much, obviously, for internal demographic reasons. It is obvious that the migration issue is key at this very moment. It is somehow determining also the result of the presidential elections this year. It matters and has defined many of the Biden administration and other U.S. administration policies in relation to Latin America, like this APEP, the American Partnership for Economic Prosperity that was launched, or the American Declaration for Orderly, Humane and Legal Migration. Economy matters to the U.S. The Latin American economy matters. This is why the NAFTA was launched many years ago, and why now imports of goods from Mexico are bigger than those coming to the U.S. from China. Nearshoring, which is also the result of this Russian aggression on Ukraine, is also pushing for more Latin America in U.S. policies, as it has pushed also Europe for more connections to the U.S. and Latin America. And there are many areas of development for these economic connection and relations, and this is something that the report will show. As I said, the digital, renewable energies, critical materials, these are new areas where both our countries, the US and Spain, will work further, and where the European Union is also trying to launch the Global Gateway, which is the sum of a great effort in supporting Latin American infrastructures from the European Union. The United States and Spain have been conscious that these connection matters, that we have to work in a triangular way. And this is why we created a group to start with, a group on Central America 2 years ago, to work together, sharing information and best practices. On Latin America, we work on migration issues, but we also work on supporting the governance of those countries and on supporting gender issues and all our SDG agenda, the Agenda 2030. The transatlantic link is essential for the future, to defend our democracy, to defend our values. And this is something that we will be listening to also today this is the presentation of this report. I'm very happy, Jose Juan, Charles, Carlos, to welcome you here in Washington today and to share this space with you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here again, surrounded by so many familiar faces and friends, and especially to present this report that has been made by the Real Instituto Elcano about something that is very close to my heart, Latin America, and trying to tell and to raise among you a debate of why Latin America matters. We are going to have these two panels talking about economics and politics. Therefore, just allow me to be more frank and tell you why we wrote this paper and why we wrote this kind of paper. For nearly 9 months, we were having interviews with think tanks in Europe, academics, politicians, members of the European Parliament, members of the Commission, members of the corporate Europe, asking them, why? What do you know about Latin America? What do you think about Latin America? And once we start this debate, we cannot stop, because it was so misguided, the answer we got, that we say, okay, we need to put all these narratives in one paper and try to find the data that supports or invalidates the priors they have. Just to put in a very short sentence, what most of these groups, different interest groups in Europe, thinks about Latin America, it's very clear. Latin America is a political disaster. It's a group of countries in which political instability is there and democracy is weak. Latin Americans are not very committed to democratic institutions. Latin America is a political disaster. Latin America is an economic disaster. They don't grow. They have wasted a lot of opportunities to become a developed country. You cannot find a single developed country in Latin America. And they have bad policies. They have bad luck, but especially bad policies and bad institutions. The third consensus that we got from most of these Europeans was also very clear. Europe and the United States are tired of Latin America. They are not looking at Latin America. And as a result of this, China, it's the hegemon, the new hegemon in the continent. There was a minor present to the Spanish people. And all of your companies that invest in Latin America during the 90s have destroyed value for the shareholder. These were the four statements that we got from Europe. And we say, okay, now we have the statement, we have the narrative. We need to put the data to see if these statements are true or not true, are just priors. And what we produce is the report that you can read in our web, which say that data kills narratives. Nothing of these priors are really supported by data. In all of these priors, you can find data that proves that people who are thinking in these terms are wrong. And these are not minor mistakes, are really big mistakes. Because to be mistake, to be wrong in how you are going to have a relationship politically or economically with the group of countries that you need now, it's really very costly from the Western Europeans. Very, very costly. This is the debate that we want to create. This is the debate we can bring to the front of our reflection. And it's a debate that Spain owes to Latin America. We don't want, or we are not especially interested in trying to bring Latin Americans to talk about Latin American issue. I think this is a mistake. Nothing is going to pay attention an Argentinian talking about the Argentinian economic problems, or the Mexican, or the Brazilian. This is not the whole experiment. What you need to have is what Alex have said in the introductory remarks. What you need is Latin Americans talking about global topics, global issues of the conversation, bringing to this conversation their experience, the way to think about problems, what has worked in Latin America and what has not worked when you talk about monetary policy, fiscal policy, democracy, erosion of democracy, or whatever, crime, climate change, whatever are the issue. What is the most important value of Latin America today in the world conversation is the experience they have in the problems that now are at the heart of the global conversation. It's not that populism lives in Latin America. Populism, we know, lives everywhere. And Latin America have been living with populism for many years, and they know how it evolves, which are the problems, how you can redress the situation, what is the importance of institution, of changing rules. This is the kind of conversation we can initiate with this report. Nothing is going to happen in climate change and climate transition without Latin America seated around the table. Nothing is going to happen if you don't talk about the Amazonas and you don't talk about the area which has the greener energy matrix in the world, which has the lithium, which has the copper, which has the water that is needed to make the climate change works. And nothing is going to happen in the risking or in the coupling from United States and China and Europe without having Latin America and the reshoring and the opportunities and the ways to invest in all these opportunities. This is the kind of things that we want to bring to the table today. And that's the reason we are so happy to be here. We think that we have data enough to falsify these priors that Europeans have on Latin America. Latin America is extremely important, not just for what it is now, but for so huge and valuable things and experience they can bring to solve some of the global problems that we are facing. Without Latin America, most of these problems are not going to find the solution in the very short period of time. We need to have Latin America talking about global issues, not talking about Latin America. And now I think I would like to present the first panel that is going to talk about economic issues. And I think it's going to be led by Ernesto Talvi. Ernesto, and you are going to be the, okay, Alex, I'll give you the floor and make your presentation.
I don't have. Yeah, I don't have a presentation, just to present the panelists. We have a great panel today. I mean, Ernesto Talvi, who's one of the co-authors of the report, will present a brief summary of the economic part of the report. And then we have two excellent discussants. As an excellent discussants, they will not discuss the presentation. They will share their views on Latin America's main problems, how they intersect with the report, and they will deepen and complement the report. And Marcela Menendez, who's the Deputy Chief Economist of the World Bank for Latin America, and Santiago Levy, who is a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and used to be the Vice President for Knowledge at the IDB, and also held many very senior positions in the Mexican government in the past. So with that, I will just say that I agree with everything that Jose Juan said, but unfortunately, I don't agree with the statement that data kills the narrative. But I think we should continue to try to show the data, discuss the data, and hopefully it will at least influence the narrative. So with that, I leave the floor to Ernesto to make his summary presentation of the report, and then we will, I think, come to these red chairs and discuss it. Ernesto Talvi, please. You have a presentation? No? Oh, just notes? And you talk? Perfect. So we can sit here and we can do it from here. Perfect. Yeah, why don't we all come here? I know. Yeah. Bueno. Technology is one of the problems we have in Latin America.
Yeah. United States.
You need better data. Bueno, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, Alex. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to see a lot of familiar faces, and hopefully we'll have, together with Marcela and Santiago, very, very good friends, a very stimulating discussion. Thank you, Ángeles, Jose Juan, for the introduction. So let's start by demystifying some of the assertions that Jose Juan was talking about. I won't talk about the political ones because we have a full panel. So let's start with the economic ones. So this is a continent that is basically an economic failure, prone to crisis, and incapable of sustaining growth for prolonged periods of time, and eventually becoming somewhat of a developed region. So fact number one, between 1974 and 2003, we had in the world 255 exchange rate, debt, financial, or any combination of the above crises. 60% of the 255 were in emerging economies. And half of the crises in emerging economies were in Latin America. So we were the main character of the movie. Actually, we had an average of 4 crises per year. Since 2003, the number of crises has declined significantly in the world to 55. Still, emerging economies are 60% of the crises, but Latin America has gone from half of those in emerging economies to a quarter. So we cannot discuss that actually both the number, less than 1 a year, and the incidence in emerging economies of crisis in Latin America has declined very, very significantly during the 21st century. And we could trace back that to basically sound policies, independent central banks, floating exchange rates, in general, fiscal consolidation, sound banking supervision and regulation, and very high levels of capitalization. But if I were to choose one and only one, and being a Calvo student, I would choose the management of international liquidity. Before the last crisis in 1998, 2003, Latin America had a ratio of 100% of international reserves to short-term debt. It was the lowest in emerging market regions except for Sub-Saharan Africa. Today, we have 400%, 4 times the reserves relative to short-term debt, and we are the best among the emerging regions except for the oil-producing countries. So I think that the sound management of international liquidity has been a very, very key factor in explaining why the incidence of crisis has diminished in absolute and in relative terms to emerging markets. Second assertion, we are a failure because we failed to converge to developed country standards of living. We are always the future and will always be, as they say for Brazil. Fine. So let's see.
we look at the relative income of Latin America relative to the US, and we are about a quarter of the US. And we look at the relative income in 1950, and we were about a quarter of the US. So there we are. Actually, in 1980, we were about a third of the US. So we are even worse than 1980. Now, who achieved the feat in the post-World War II of going from underdevelopment, and we define that as less than a third of the GDP per capita of the US, to development, more than 2/3 of the GDP per capita of the US? Only 5 countries did it, which is Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. That's it, nobody else. So this is convergence from underdevelopment to development is a very, very, very unlikely event. Basically, it has probability 0 of occurring. So actually, judging our performance relative to an unattainable objective, it's not only unfair, it is wrong. Actually, I've came to believe that it is not even a very conducive policy objective, convergence. It's very difficult to obtain. It's very difficult to know how to do it. It's very difficult to sell that we are actually doing that when we don't know how to do it. So the real challenge for Latin America is growth, which is not the same as convergence. We need to grow, and we failed to do it. We've not been growing for the last 10 years, and we only managed to grow at relatively high rates when we have a favorable external environment, either high commodity prices or favorable financial conditions, or both. And that's a key challenge that we actually pinpoint in the report. But the objective has to be to try to rekindle growth. Convergence is a whole different animal, very, very, very unlikely and very difficult to achieve. Actually, let me say, the only emerging region that is an exception to the rule of non-convergence is Asia. And the others are exactly the same as that same pattern as Latin America since the 50s. All the others. And in Asia, look at the 2 super performers. Look at China and India. After phenomenal rates of growth for the last 30 years in China, China has just achieved the levels of income per capita of Latin America now, of the average Latin American country. And it actually is cooling off at very substantial rates. So it seems it's run out of steam. What about India? Also a formidable performance. India's GDP per capita is still less than half that of Latin America. So they are not even yet there. China is there. Let's see how they perform from now on. It doesn't look too good. Okay, so let me go to the and this is a kind of, I always say it because one deserves it. He did a work of archaeological digging of data on Spanish firms to try to see whether, why are we investing in this disaster zone? Crisis, non-convergence, no growth. You cannot earn money here. You lose value for your shareholders here. That's what we are leaving. Well, first, the assertion is wrong. What Jose Juan measured was a return, net return of 4.8% a year for Spanish firms in Latin America, compared to 3.5% a year for the equivalent investments in the developed world. Okay, we pay more because we are riskier, that's fine, but they still make money. In most of the countries, a lot of the time, not all the time. This is business. So, second, you're not leaving. How come we are not leaving? No, you're not leaving. actually you are reinvesting all the profits that you are making in Latin America. So this is like a stealth kind of FDI. It's a very silent, it's not the big privatizations and the big acquisitions. It is simply modestly reinvesting 100% of the proceeds in Latin America. So they are not only staying, they are betting that Latin America is going to generate, once again, meaningful profits for the shareholders, or meaningful value for the shareholders. Now, we know that European firms and American firms are not leaving, but the premise was that since they are leaving, they opened up the field for China to become the hegemonic player in Latin America. So we know that they are not leaving, but so has China become the hegemonic player in Latin America? And the answer is essentially no. And we look at some important dimensions. First, for Mexico, Santiago, as export and import market, as source of finance, as source of FDI, as a destination for migrants, for tourists, for students. I mean, the US is the only game in town. China has nothing to do in the game. So if we want to see something interesting, we have to look at South America. I mean, Mexico and Central America are completely tied up to the United States. So we went and looked at South America, and South America is a very different story. Why? Because it's very European. Very European. And you look at anything you want to look at, FDI, the stock of FDI, Chinese FDI, is only larger than 5% of GDP in Panama. Then everything from there goes below. The stock of FDI of the US and the EU is 30 times that of China. Okay? And the stock of EU FDI is 2.5 times in South America that of the United States. Okay? And the question is, yeah, but that's the history. I mean, China is a very recent player, so you have to look at the flows. Well, we looked at the flows. And the flows of FDI from China to South America are less than half of what you would expect given China's size in the economy. So, and I don't want to go into finance bilateral lending. Bilateral lending is limited to a handful of countries. And Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Guyana, Jamaica, Dominica, that's it. For the rest of the countries, bilateral lending by China doesn't appear in the radar. The flows of bilateral lending are collapsing as the economy is slowing down in China and the loans became sour. So that's, and it has been actually in net terms negative since 2017. So the stock of bilateral lending has been declining for the last 6 years. And moreover, when you compare the stock of lending of China to the whole of Latin America, again, compared to the IMF, the World Bank, and the Paris Club, the lookalikes of official lending, then it is less than half of what you would expect the share of China, given the size it has in the world economy. So finally, let's look at trade. Well, there the things change. South America 80% of exports are natural resources and primary products or industrialization of any of the above. And China is the main market. Actually, China is as big as the US and the European Union combined as an export market for South American products. South America imports manufactured goods. 75% of our imports are manufactured goods. Where do we import them from? China. So China's supplies, manufactured goods, are equivalent to the sum of the EU and the US combined. So that's true. And but at the same time, if you look at what kind of goods do we, 2 minutes, great. What kind of goods do we sell from South America to China? And the highly sophisticated and high value added goods that we sell, only 6% go to China and 60% go to the US and the EU. So if we expect to move a la growth lab in Harvard through the sophistication ladder of our export basket and production matrix, then our natural markets are the US and the EU, not China. So they are our natural partners, and that's why, and we'll go into that in the discussion, and with work we did with Tony Estevadordal and Alex, we are suggesting very strongly the strategic convenience of financing once and for all. We know it's difficult. The EU-Mercosur agreement, not as a final destination, but as a stepping stone in a very deep and aggressive and ambitious integration between the European Union and the whole of Latin America. And to finalize, Jose Juan, the addendum that it's not in the report, but that we just finished, is that this alleged Chinese hegemony has had the effect of getting Latin America, weaken the alignment of Latin America with the West. Well, that falls too. You look at security, and you know what's the percentage of arms sales of China to Central America and Mexico, to South America? 0. Mexico buys close to 90% of the arms from the US. We, the South Americans, buy 60% of our arms from the European Union. What's the track record of voting in the UN for the last 23 years? Resolutions. Well, when it comes to the economy, trade and development, when it comes to economic sanctions, Latin America aligns itself with China, not with the US and the EU. Now, all of the other emerging economies do exactly the same. So we are not actually aligning with China, we are aligning with our peers, the emerging market bloc of which China is part. Now, if you look at the resolution that have to do with values, human rights, democracy, and territorial integrity, Latin America votes consistently, overwhelmingly, together with the European Union and the United States, and it is by far, by a killing, the most Western region in the whole emerging spectrum, including the accession countries of Eastern Europe that are aspire to go into the European Union. So hopefully this gives us some material to talk about.
Lots of data. So let me turn now to Marcela, please.
Okay. Thank you. I enjoyed reading the report. I think it brings together a story. As who have been looking at the region for long, know and share the idea of bringing this vision of a place where there has been progress in some fronts. I think it's commendable. I think the big element in the conversation and the one that we should probably be talking about today is that the region doesn't grow. I agree with you. I don't even want to get into the convergence conversation, but we will have a problem because it's a region that stagnates. And jumping onto the second chapter that looks at the political turmoil, there is one conclusion, I guess, that is directly connected, saying like, listen, what we're seeing in the region, it's not structural and it's associated to the region not growing. So we are back at, I think, at step one. I don't have the answers, but I want to bring some other variables to the table when we look at the region and try to figure why the hell we are unable to grow. The first thing is the way in which our labor market works. The way the workforce is distributed across business sizes is typically in Latin America more similar to what happens in India and Pakistan and Nepal. And it's extremely different to what we see in Europe and in the US. We have about 32% of the labor force in businesses of more than 10 employees. All of the rest is spread out, 30% in self-employment, another 30% in little businesses of less than 5 employees, and then a 10% sort of in businesses that are from 5 to 10. In the US, the number for like same figure for workers that are in firms of more than 10 employees is 77%. I was trying to open my presentation to see the exact numbers, but then in the EU, it's a slightly smaller. Let me bring it out. Just take me a second. Sorry. Because the numbers are astonishing. Okay, so it's 32% of workers in Latin America in businesses of more than 10 employees, while in the United States, 77%. In the higher income European countries, it's 69%. In the lower income European countries, it's 61%. So we have a very fragmented low tail of the business size distribution in tiny low productivity units where people are making tiny incomes. And on the other extreme of the distribution, we have these very few giant firms and basically a non-existent segment of medium and small size businesses in most of our countries. We keep asking ourselves why we have not been able to create this segment that will capture all of these fragmented labor force. And then there are some possible candidates behind that. One, Santiago has been talking a long time throughout his life about this, but we have messy regulatory frameworks. And we have messy regulatory frameworks in taxation, and also when we look at labor markets and social protection. In the last year, I have been collecting regulations for labor markets and social protection systems for a set of Latin American countries and some comparators. At what we're finding, I've been doing this with a colleague, Marcela Slava, who's a Colombian economist. And what we find is not only high non-salary cost rates, but also huge variation across countries and also within countries. To the extent that it could happen that firms of the same size in the same sector, located in a different place in some countries, and with a different composition of their workforce, can have completely different costs. So we have a problem not only of high labor costs, but also of a very uneven playing field for firms to compete. I am talking about like wide variation, but for instance, in Brazil, a maximum of around 77, close to 80% in non-labor salary costs, non-salary labor costs, and then a minimum of around 30%. So regulatory frameworks are a problem, and they are also a problem for investors when they want to come to our countries. The other big problem, I just sort of mentioned it, these giant firms. We have very concentrated markets in Latin America and very high markups. When we look, there's been this concern in Europe and in the advanced economies about markets becoming more concentrated and markups increasing. When you look at the Latin American numbers, we are already there, and we have always been. We don't have this same increasing trend, but we have a very high average markups, and we are already at the place where Europe and the US are afraid they will be coming to. We have like this connected to why does this matter? I think it matters because this economic power translates into political power. Business political power is one of the things that could push the region forward or hold it back. And I think it's behind many of the things that don't happen. For instance, we don't have strong competition agencies in the country, and they have been held back by the lobby of the biggest firms. To give you a sense of what I'm talking about, when you look at the revenues of the 50 largest firms in Chile, they represent 70% of GDP. In Mexico, 40% of GDP. In Colombia and Brazil, around 30 to 35% of free GDP. So this is a massive problem that we have. And I said I would bring the problems to the table and not the solutions. But I think that's part of what messes us up in terms of being able to grow. We have these giant firms and very little domestic competition within, because we don't have this segment of small and medium firms and all of this workforce spread, as I said. Even our largest firms are not, that they are the most productive within our markets, but they are not as productive as their peers in other markets, in other regions. Two more things to bring to the table. You mentioned it, migration. We have seen migration grow by about 60% since 2015, and I'm talking about internal migration, the people who are arriving into our countries. And this is a big challenge and also a big opportunity, and some of our countries are trying to get organized to be able to take advantage of that. When I think about lost opportunities in Latin America, I think about transforming labor markets to bring in all this migrant human capital that is arriving, and also somehow mobilizing all of the female labor force that is out and not participating in labor markets. 50% of females on average do not work. Imagine what would happen if we could mobilize, I don't know, a quarter of them in terms of the potential economic growth. But the challenge of migration is there, and it's like, I think there are things that are holding the region back. So I don't know how magically we can start taking advantage of more trade integration or so on and so forth. We're just not, I think, unless we somehow unleash these things that are holding us back, it's very, very complicated. And the last point that I wanted to make, we have become excellent exporters of organized crime. The region is the most violent region in the world. We have 9% of the population and 1/3 of the homicides worldwide. And when you look at homicide rates, the Latin American homicide rate on average is about 4 times, a little less than 4 times the world homicide rate. But what is super sad is that it's the only one that in the last 2 decades has increased when you look at rural regions. So we know that there are many sources of violence, but the one source of violence that is behind most of the horror that we're looking at is organized crime, and that a few years back we thought this was directly connected to just drug trafficking, and that we, in some forests, we said that if there was legalization or something like that, this would be contained. I no longer think that, because the technology is spreading to different markets. So it's a spread to traffic of people, it's spread to illegal mining, and it's spread even to like the migration routes. So this is a huge problem, and I don't know how we can be speaking about innovation and grasping trade opportunities unless we bring that to the conversation. So that's, I guess, my invitation, and I will stop there, because there's a lot of things that we as economists don't usually speak about. But unless we connect those conversations, the region will stay trapped where it is.
Thanks, Marcela. Now, please, Santiago.
No? Does it work now? Thank you. I want to begin by thanking Alex for the invitation. It's always great to be here at the Georgetown Americas Institute. Since it started not too long ago, 2 years ago, it's become, I think, the premier forum for discussions of Latin America and Washington. So that's wonderful. And it's great to have this discussion here. And it's great to have a discussion of a paper written by very good friends, some dear friends that we've worked together for many years. And lovely to see you, Jose Juan, Carlos, and Ernesto. And it's always very nice when you read a report that challenges you. It challenges you, it makes you think, I thought something different, and these guys are telling me something different from what I usually think every day. Why are these guys telling? And what they're trying to tell me is, look, the glass is half full, and you Latinos are always looking at the glass half empty, and you're wrong, because not only is the glass half full, but it's kind of transitory, and soon enough it's going to start getting higher and higher, and it's going to be more than half full. It's going to be better. So there's a nice optimism in the report, which is welcome, which is a contrast to the sort of unending pessimism that characterizes most of the people who work on Latin America. That is welcome, is refreshing. It forces you to think about things, and that's good. I don't have a lot of the quibbles with most of the macro stuff that Ernesto described. I think that with some exceptions, obviously Argentina, Venezuela, but taking away those guys, most of the neighborhood in Latin America has done the macro homework and has done the macro homework well. In no small part because some people that have done it, Alejandro was part of the team in Mexico who achieved that. Ernesto has written immensely about that. So has Jose Juan. The people that worked on macro in Latin America have done a very good job. And so macro, again, take away some exceptions, is not the issue. And we stand out actually relative to other regions of the world. So from that perspective, Latin America is a good region. So the core issues, and I think the next panel will speak about the politics, so I'll just center on the economics. The core issue is it didn't converge. It did the macro homework, which was the terrible thing before in the 80s, and it didn't converge. And so there are two assertions in the report, one of which I agree and one on which I disagree. And I will first mention one I agree and then the one I disagree and why, or at least partly disagree. The first assertion in the report I think is a really important one. It says, look, if you look across the world, no region of the world is trying to both build democracy and develop at the same time. So it's extremely difficult to do both things at the same time, to develop and to be a democratic region. That's assertion number one. Assertion number two is the region has set the basis for socially inclusive growth, and there's some transitory disturbances associated with the world context, but the fundamental work has done, and we should in the future expect socially inclusive growth. I don't know if I'm reading you right, but a little bit that's my take on sort of what the report says. So why is it so difficult to have convergence with democracy? It shouldn't be in principle. Democracy says, look, as opposed to, Korea in the 1960s and the 1970s, in Latin America, where much more democratic societies, people are not willing to just put up with trickle-down economics. They're not going to wait for growth to take place and eventually some redistribution to take place by growth. They want redistribution to take place today. And because we are a democracy, the electoral game is played through redistribution. Parties that promise redistribution get to power, and parties keep power by redistribution because we're unequal societies, and in unequal societies, redistribution matters a lot. So that is partly some of the explanation why trying to grow in democracy is so very difficult. But if you think a little bit deeper, why? Why is it that redistribution and faster growth, I don't want to use the word convergence, but let's say convergence below below the abajito de la mesa, under the table, but let's say faster growth. Why is it that redistribution and faster growth are so difficult to achieve? And I think this is the point where I disagree with the report. I think we have not done the full homework in terms of setting the basis for socially inclusive and sustainable growth. We have done the macro right, palomita. We have done the trade liberalization part and foreign investment right, palomita. We have also done, by and large, not super, but reasonable, the investments in human capital part, palomita. So you would look at that and you say, look, you guys did the macro right, you did the foreign investment right, you did investments in human capital. Why aren't you growing faster? Why isn't conversion taking place? And what is the connection of this with democracy? And I think we didn't do the homework in one dimension. There's a fundamental dimension for democratic societies to be prosperous. And that homework was, we did not build a welfare state that is functional and that can support socially inclusive. What do I mean by a functional welfare state? I mean, one, that redistributes, two, that is fiscally sustainable, and three, very, very importantly, that is friendly to productivity. And that we didn't do. What we did in the region, after doing the macro right and doing the trade part right and doing the human capital part, is we made a mess of social protection because governments responded to the calls for redistribution and for social protection, not by doing the homework, but by avoiding doing the homework. Rather than reforming the welfare states, what we did is we created a parallel welfare state. And we created a hodgepodge of redistributive mechanisms that nobody pays much attention to, because everybody claps whenever there's a health program on, everybody claps whenever there's a pension program, everybody claps whenever there's a poverty program, and very few people pay attention to the underlying microeconomic impact of that on the labor market, as Marcela was well pointing out, and on the sort of distortions that Marcela was mentioning briefly that are reflected in the composition of employment, in the size distribution of firms, that are very much associated with the nature of the welfare state. In my view, it is impossible to explain the structure of employment and the structure of firms, very small set of large firms, one tail of distribution, a huge number of very small firms, and a lot of self-employment, about 60% of the labor force in the region on average, either working on its own or in firms of 2-3 people, kind of 19th century. It's impossible to explain that without alluring to the dual structure of the welfare states that the region has, in which formal workers get a set of benefits that are paid for by the sort of things that Marcela was speaking about, non-wage cost, and informal workers get paid all sorts of benefits that are getting better and better because of the political pressure for the distribution, and that are creating dysfunctional labor markets. In Latin America, more than half of the labor force works informally. This has not changed very much. And even in countries that have grown, this has not changed either. So the fundamental reason why convergence does not occur is not because democracy was there. The fundamental reason why convergence did not occur is because productivity stagnated. And productivity did not stagnate because the macro was wrong, the trade was wrong, or the human capital was wrong. Productivity stagnated in the region because labor markets were dysfunctional and therefore firm dynamics were dysfunctional. The key fundamental fact to think about Latin America growth over the last 30 decades is, with minor exceptions, if you look at the region as a whole, over 30 years, productivity in the region has grown zero. Zero. That's the fundamental question. Why is it that a region that has macro stability, is open to international trade, has invested in human capital, has democratic institutions, is not able to increase its productivity? And so I think I'm going to quote just a little bit, just one thing from the report. The report says, I'm almost quoting verbatim, the economic, political, and social advances that are necessary for the foundations for socially inclusive and sustainable growth are there. This is the part of the report that I disagree. We did not construct functional welfare states, and this reflects the political dynamics of societies that are exclusive, in the Acemoglu and Robinson sense, of having exclusive institutions. And we just manage the democratic pressures through the distribution through the creation of exclusive institutions that have actually been an impediment to growth. Convergence should have occurred because there's nothing conceptually that says you cannot have productivity growth in democratic societies. But if the democratic response to the political pressure for the distribution are policies that depress productivity, then you don't have convergence. And that's where we stand, I think, in the region today. And now let me come to close because I know the time is pressuring on us. I think the report by Del Cano is actually both very timely, but potentially very important. When we Latinos look at ourselves, well, we actually, as I think was the one was saying, well, the Argentinians talk about the Argentinians and the Mexicans talk about the Mexicans. Nobody listens to each other anymore. You know, sort of a cacophony of voices. We're lost. But it's always good if you have somebody from the outside who's a friend, and I mean Spain, somebody from the outside, and you have a neutral, serious think tank like is Elcano, and you have really competent people like Ernesto and Carlos and Jose Juan. It's extremely good when they take a cold look at the region from the outside and you say, look, guys, you can do it. You're much better than what you think you are, but there's certain things that you need to do. And maybe Spain can give you some highlights as to how you can actually work in that direction, because you guys have actually shown how redistribution and democracy works. So there's nothing incompatible inherent. But over the medium run, you did a good job. So let me congratulate Jose Juan and Carlos and Ernesto. I hope this provokes a little bit of a dialogue. And thank you, Alex, again for the opportunity. Lovely to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Santiago. We have like 20 minutes. So let me go to a very short question to each of our speakers, and then we'll have time to open up for questions from the audience. So maybe starting with Marcela. I mean, you ended, unfortunately, with a topic that you're working a lot, and it has been on your program for the World Bank, but more than that, I mean, personally for you, that a lot of institutions are thinking about it right now, and it's security. You mentioned the homicide rate in Latin America, the concentration. What do you think are the main causes? What is Latin America so much different than other regions? And obviously, this will lend itself to a whole seminar. But what are your initial thoughts on the causes behind this, and what could be an approach to start trying to control this?
That's a hard question. I wish I knew the answer, but one thing that I find very surprising is that we have so much trouble innovating and adopting technology, but with organized crime, we seem to have managed. No, and it's probably the fact that it somehow really has a return that people can see very immediately. And as I said, I don't have the answer, so I'm just thinking out loud. But you have this problem of how do we prevent these young people and kids from going into gangs. A few days back, I don't know if you saw this article in El País talking about this criminal who belonged to La Camorra, 32-year-old guy who, during his prison time, became a professional and wrote a thesis in sociology and has this huge reflection. But one of the things that he says is that when he joined the Camorra, he really was looking for a family. He came from a poor family, but not from a criminal family, but it somehow gave him a place where he belonged. So I guess there's something, like I immediately connected to our stories. I think there's something missing. We are not being able to offer young kids and young people the right opportunities in our countries. And I want to contradict Santiago, this is a conversation that we've had long ago. He says, like, we have completed the investments or done huge investments in human capital. I think we're completely lagging in human capital. I think we have been able to improve schooling, but I think we don't have education systems that actually translate into a good engagement of people into the labor market. And all of what we're seeing is probably the result, in terms of what I was telling you, in the business market, is the result of both these messed up regulations, but also the fact that our human capital is very low. I don't know if you've seen the statistics, but for instance, there's a recent one from the World Bank looking at children 10-year-old in Colombia, 60% of which cannot read at 10 years old. And we systematically perform in the worst places, in PISA and tests everywhere. So I think the fact that we are not being able to actually capture these young people into possibilities where they can see opportunities for a life that they can build and value, I think that's it. And the solution is a very long-term one, but I think that's part of the problem. And I don't understand, people in the profession will disagree with me, but I think there's also some cultural thing whereby just the easy, like el atajo, decimos en español, is very easily adopted, where wherever I can take a shortcut, I will take it. And that's a mindset, and I don't know why, but I think that's part of the problem.
Very insightful, and I think it's a topic we should continue to, hopefully, I mean, the World Bank and other institutions will continue to work on it and give us better light on that. Maybe turning to Ernesto, you use a significant part of your presentation to explain why our perception, or why the perceptions of Chinese influence in the region are overblown. And can you at least explore for us why this difference between, I mean, this seems to be, according to your data, another area in which narrative and data are disconnected. Why is the case? And if not, why is China getting such a huge return on very marginal investments? No, because it seems that, given your data, politically and geopolitically in the region, it is considered a much more important partner than what it actually is. So how do you put these two things together?
In Uruguay, Alex, we had the lowest, you used to have the lowest crime rates in the region, together with Chile. Very low compared to other countries in Latin America. When you look at the perception of insecurity, Uruguay was number one. So, wow, the facts and the perception do not seem to square very well. So we always argued that it was extremely positive, because since the trend was increasing, there was an increment in crime from very low levels, but it was something that it was affecting us very substantially, because in Colombia, at the time when I looked at this, and in other more violent societies, the perception of risk was of insecurity was not as large, because people got used to violence. So, in a sense, Alex, China is the new kid in town. I mean, it was 2% of the world economy in 1990, and it's 18% today. So things are increasing from zero. And when you increase a lot from zero, well, you make a lot of noise. But when you add it up, it's not very different from zero. It's not zero anymore. And it actually, when you look at the flows of many of these things, it is not actually converging towards neither the US or Europe, let alone the two of them combined. So that would be, it's a marginal effect. It's the fact that it's the new kid in town. It's the fact that it has been increasing very significantly from a starting point that was inexistent.
Santiago, before we open up the floor to questions from the audience, I mean, maybe this change in the social contract that you're proposing, it also presents an important conflict with democracy, that the division of power lends itself to marginal changes in policy frameworks. And what you're suggesting is that we need a change of framework that under democracy also becomes extremely different to do. I mean, we have the case of Milei with a different change of framework that is being proposed, not the one that you're proposing, but basically trying to do that, but also campaigning on that change. And at least according to his proposal to Argentinian society, is what he campaigned on, and therefore that's a mandate that he has. So in that case, how do you envision your proposal being implemented in our democracies, that at the end of the day we end up having a minority representation at the executive class, maybe the first minority in government, then we have independent Supreme Courts, and then we have at the subnational level also a pretty even distribution of power. So, and maybe that's for the next panel, but how do we implement this thing politically?
No, that's a really excellent question. And you're right about something you mentioned in the beginning, which I think is, in democratic context, it's the marginal change that is the voters looking at. It's you know, the status quo is taken as given, and then campaigns are made about a marginal change in this and you know, some promise along some dimension. And what I'm questioning is, I'm saying, as long as we keep on playing that game, we're going to be stuck. And so the real challenge, as I see it, it's not so much to get at least not first, to get the political process to deliver change, because the change that I'm seeking about could be delivered gradually. What I think is more important is for the ideas of people to change. It is symptomatic of the report by the Elcano Institute, but if you pick up a report by the IDB, mea culpa, I work there, and if you pick up a report by the World Bank, yeah, bro. If you pick a report by the World Bank, and if you pick, what I'm talking about is not even on the table. And this is, I think, the major missing point, is the thought that if we continue along the route, it's just a matter of time. And once more investments in human capital is in place, and you know, the world economy picks up, then we're going to increase growth. Forget French. We're going to increase growth. And that hasn't happened. And so the mind frame has to change, in my view. The ideas have to change. And then there is a challenge, you're quite correct, of putting that into the political process. But then you could promise gradual change. And what I think is feasible is that the underlying equilibrium that I'm proposing, it's win-win respect to the current equilibrium. Because output is much bigger and the economy is much more efficient. And it's achievable. There are no fundamental losers. I'm not tackling the big corporate interests that Marcela's talking about. I'm talking about changing the ideas about how to structure the social contract.
Thanks. So we have time for 2 or 3 questions. So we have some. Please tell us your name and where you're coming from.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jarek McAllister. I'm a student at the Center for German and European Studies, but I'm also doing a certificate in Latin American Studies. Thank you for coming to speak with us today. My question is, do you believe that a China-Mercosur free trade agreement is more likely than one between the EU and Mercosur? Like, there are a variety of factors which are obstacles to an EU-Mercosur agreement, but why exactly is there not one between China and Mercosur? Like, is it a necessity, you know, given that China is already in a very dominant position with respect to trade, or what is your take on that exactly? Thank you.
We take the other one.
Thank you. I am Gabriel Farfán. I teach public finance at Georgetown University. Thanks for being here and very interesting. I look forward to read the report. So my question has to do with maybe the content of the report in the way that in Mexico, there are 3 institutions that measure the employment that is provided by organized crime. According to these institutions, the organized crime in Mexico goes from the 3rd to the 5th employer in Mexico after FEMSA and Walmart. So I think, we are talking about between 200,000, 250,000 jobs directly provided by organized crime. There are other studies that calculate the amount of fiscal or taxes that are being lost there because of the extortion business in Mexico is very high. But we can talk about other countries too. So my question is, the report has some kind of maybe a chapter, I don't know, on not only this, but also the role of informality, which is not the same as the jobs provided by the organized crime. But what is the role of informality? In Mexico, I'm from Mexico, but probably there are figures in other countries. A report has just been released that informality has been growing a lot, grew a lot in the last year. So informality is also playing a bigger role in economies in Latin America, Mexico, but we can quote other countries too. So my question would be, these sort of issues are part of the report. And just one last thing, sorry, in Mexico, we just heard also that the Chinese automobiles are around 10-15% of all the automobiles sold in Mexico. So, they started 2 years ago in 3%, and now we're reaching in 2024, 15% of all the automobiles. I can quote other figures, but I think China is not from the 1990s. It's just something that is very present in many economies. Just that. Thank you. Just that.
Sorry.
Yeah, some women representation in all these questions. Hi, my name is Veronica. I am from Colombia, and my question is really about women. I didn't hear anything about what is the role of women in all of this. In terms of informality, it is very high in Latin American countries. We have a lot of gender-based violence in Latin America. So what is the stake for women? What is the prescription in all the economic and productivity? So thank you.
Thank you. So I'll give the floor to each of our speakers, maybe quickly for 2 minutes. And I think you touched upon topics that are evenly distributed between our 3 panelists. So I will start with Ernesto, 2 minutes, then Marcela, and then we'll end up with Santiago.
One of the questions. Okay, so we put one.
At the end, at the beginning.
No, we have revised this report as a working process. We are going to enlarge the report, and the second edition of the report will bring this idea of informality, gender. That's something that is in our agenda, and of course we are going to talk about crime. It's what most of our board members have asked after the report. They want to have what is going on Latin America on crime, organized crime, and the impact on business.
Thanks. So, Ernesto.
So this is the final wrap-up, or it's only the questions?
This is the final wrap-up.
For all the...
Well, you're losing like 30 seconds.
Well, let me, because if it is the final wrap-up, I wanted to say 2 or 3 very, very brief things. First, very happy that we focused on growth, not convergence, growth. That's the key. You brought up very interesting aspects of it, miniaturization versus concentration, the the reform of the welfare state, the participation of female labor, blah, blah, blah. So it's an open agenda. We are not going to have a formula. The second comment I want to make is that why did we do all the homework, Santiago, and we did not converge? What? We did not grow at a sustained level. Well, we oversold. Let's do a mea culpa. We essentially in the 90s said if you do the macro, if you do the trade liberalization, if you do the deregulation, if you do fiscal consolidation and you reduce inflation, then you open the doors to prosperity. Well, it is not the case. Prosperity is a very, very elusive compared to the developed world. Is a very elusive and difficult task. So we oversold, and that's a mea culpa. We created expectation that something was going to happen that actually didn't. We didn't deliver the way. Now you say, and I agree with you, well, we still have a lot of homework to do, especially in the reform of the welfare state. And I agree with you that that's a very key aspect. And in this sense, I was always a great admirer, and my model was always Spain. I don't know if I'm going to characterize it because I never like to look at Asia. I like to look at Spain. Why? Because to me, maybe I'm falsifying history, and I have a lot of historians here, but let me say it very simply. Spain had democratization, integration, and development, prosperity, German type kind of prosperity. Okay, that's our path. Democracy, integration, which is humongously lacking. We need something that actually commits us to do a lot of these things with a big price down the road. And I think the European Union Mercosur agreement and the extension to Latin America has that potential. And finally, I'll answer the question there. The China Mercosur agreement, I may be wrong, is not going to occur anytime soon. Brazil doesn't want it. And it doesn't want it because it doesn't want to be able to sell with a little bit more ease what we already sell them, and being inundated by their manufactured goods that in the high end of sophistication, if we produce ourselves, it will help us develop. So I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And if it's not happening with the European Union, it is in great part because for the European Union, it's being very difficult to deliver on the agreement.
Marcela.
I am super happy that you will have a chapter on crime, organized crime, as well as migration, are issues that go over national borders. We keep saying that they need regional and coordinated solutions. I'll say here we need global and coordinated solutions. So that's like my most important closing message. I just wanted to highlight that I did mention women. When we think about women in Latin America, my biggest concern is labor participation, and I'd say labor supply more generally, because women, even when they participate in the labor market, they spend less hours on paid work because they are doing all these hours of unpaid work. So the conversation goes directly to care systems and how we develop them and how we pay for them. That goes straight to what Santiago was saying in terms of rethinking our welfare states. That's it.
So really quickly, because I know we're pressed for time. I agree with you. I'm going to touch on your point. I agree with you that we overpromised and that fast growth required more than what we had on the list. We underinvested in institutions. But I also think that we were partly wrong, that our conceptual view of the world was partly wrong. And the big mistake was, look, informality is kind of a minor issue. And as soon as growth accelerates, it will fade away. And maybe we should have thought, growth is not accelerating because informality is there. That was, I think, in my view, the one single largest conceptual mistake made over the last 30 years. Stop here.
Thank you very much. Marcela, go ahead.
One little thing that I forgot to say, but it's a big thing. We are entering, from the World Bank, we're entering an alliance with the IDB and CAF to start working together on generating knowledge on organized crime and violence. That's where we need help and where the European Union could come in, because we don't fully understand what is going on. And there is no systematic information being generated that will allow us to understand the problem and how to tackle it. So that's like wider place for more collaboration.
Well, let me thank Santiago, Marcela, and Ernesto, and introduce Moises Naim, who will chair the next panel. He's a distinguished fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. There's a short break. Vamos a empezar. Sí, órale, sale. Depende de la edad.
Exacto.
Hi everyone. Oh, sorry. Hi everyone. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break. There's coffee and some cookies outside if you want, and then we'll get started in 5 minutes. seated. We're going to start our second panel in a couple of minutes, so find your way to your seat.
Listo. Comenzamos con el segundo panel, conversando desde el punto de vista de política. Tenemos un panel maravilloso: José Juan Ruiz, Cindy Arnson, que está en el Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, y Carlos Malamud, el reconocido latinoamericanólogo del Instituto Elcano. Comencemos, vamos a tratar de tener una conversación muy dinámica, así que los invito a interrumpirse los unos a los otros y estar en profundo desacuerdo sin llegar a la agresión física. Bueno, si te insistes, sí. Vamos a comenzar con José Juan. Primero vamos a declarar que nos gustó mucho el estudio. En inglés. Should I start from the beginning? I just was saying we have a wonderful panel, and we're going to go from there. José Juan, let me start with you. There is a theme that runs through a lot of conversations about what happens in Latin America and why. And one of the culprits that is always or often presented is inequality, a subject that was not touched in the prior panel. It was indirectly mentioned, but not touched. And it's part of the political conversation and the social conversation in the media and of inequality. You know, in Latin America, a big one is one of the most unequal regions in the world. What does your study tell us about that?
See, okay. Let me try to answer your question
Briefly.
very briefly, with some thought. We were talking that Latin America was one of the only places in the emerging world that was trying to get developed and at the same time building a democratic system. The other singularity that often it's lost in this debate is that Latin America has been the only country or the only area in the world which has been able to integrate in the world economy and to reduce inequality. And this is something that is quite unusual. You have seen all the countries which have integrated in the world economy, who have grown faster than in the past, and inequality has increased. But in Latin America, this has not happened. Two reasons. First, inequality was very high at the starting point. The initial condition matters. And this is something that can explain that. The second, and this is most important because it's most encouraging for Latin Americans and policymakers, is that you can decide, even with all the failures that Santiago was telling us before, you can introduce in your policy this concern about inequality, and you can build policies to compensate for the increasing inequality that can follow the opening of the economy. And I think this has happened in Latin America. And it's acknowledged, but most of the critics or most the analysts. And the numbers are really very, very impressive. Maybe we have this problem with the welfare state, which is not a working and sustainable welfare state. But if you look at you go and look at the numbers of inequality, not just poverty inequality, and you go abroad, what you will find is that the largest decrease in inequality in the emerging markets has happened in Latin America. And this is important, and this is not often recalled. This is in the ESG report, and I think it's important.
Thank you very much. Cindy, you were telling me before we came here, you told me how there is a whole issue. First, that you like the report very much, but the report included several items. The report failed to include several items that you feel are important to explain why Latin America seems to matter less than it should.
Great. Thanks so much, Moises. Thanks to the organizers of this conference for the kind invitation. The thing that I think I like the most about the report is that it takes us out of the world of what Albert Hirschman famously called fracasomania, the sense that Latin America is failing, that we're always pessimistic, that there's always things to criticize. And I think that it does a very effective case in making those arguments. My critique, however, number one, is that it makes and repeats the strong connection between economic growth and political discontent. And I think that there's certainly a lot of validity to that. We saw it in the 2019 protests that took place all over the region as a result of economic stagnation and the failure of the region to grow. But it is not just the economy that concerns people. And Marcela pointed this out in the last panel. Crime and violence is now the top concern in many countries. Obviously, places like El Salvador, where we've seen Bukele just reelected in a massive show of support, but also in places like Ecuador and even in Chile. And it's not sufficient to just look at the homicide rates. Even though Latin America has the world's record in terms of the number of homicides, the figure that you used is slightly different than the one that I have, which is that according to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, Latin America has about 8% of the global population, half of the homicides in the world. Now, those figures may be slightly out of date because their data usually are, but that the average rate is 10 times that of other emerging markets. So I think that it's wonderful news to hear that the World Bank, the CAF, the IDB are going to be tackling this issue because it's central and it's top of the mind in places where it wasn't. To go back to a case like Chile, something like 30% of households report that someone in their home had been the victim of a crime in the last year. This is a record in all of the years of compiling statistics on this issue. So it's not just homicides, it's assaults, it's robberies, it's petty crime, it's somebody stealing your cell phone. And I think that that's a really important phenomenon. Another aspect that I found that really took cold comfort was the point that Latin America, that there's a recession globally in democratic values and democracy in general. That, again, is cold comfort to me. I think in Latin America, there are reasons to be concerned. I think the figure that Latino Barometro uses is only 47% of the population believes that that democracy is the best form of government. That's a significant decline. LAPOP, the Americas Barometer, has a majority of people supporting, but it's still a dramatic decline over the last 10 years. Young people are much less attached to democracy, those with less education. So this goes to the deficit in human capital and education, which I think is something that bodes ill for the future. There's also, I think, much more fragmentation in Latin America than before, and it goes to the difficulty of doing the kinds of reforms that Santiago Levy was pointing out. When a president comes to office and lacks a majority in the legislature, it is very hard to get things done. And the proliferation of parties and the almost disappearance of traditional parties. Look at a country like Colombia. Liberals and conservatives used to dominate, the political scenario. That is problematic. The growth of social media in disseminating fake news. I mean, yes, it helps mobilize and connect people, but it also has a very pernicious effect. And this is not addressed as one of the problems of democracy in the region. And finally, just the last point that I want to put out there is that there is a sense that Latin America can return to a period of high levels of growth, that the stagnation of the decade of the second decade of the 2000s does not have to be the model. And I would argue that, it's not clear how that growth is going to occur. The 2000s showed this enormous growth in demand by China for primary commodities. That was the reason behind these growth rates of 4 to 6, 7%. It was at a time when China itself was growing 10 or 11%. And its economic, I guess any country that claims 4.5 rate annual growth should be celebrated in this day and age. But that still is a fraction of what Chinese growth used to be. And there was also a very, I think, important World Bank report that came out in 2012 that goes to the point about inequality, that the largest class that grew during the period of the boom was the class of those considered vulnerable. And it's precisely those people who have fallen back into poverty as a result of the pandemic, as a result of high inflation, of increased food security, whatever. These people vote, and these people make demands in the street. So a lot is being said about the opportunity that Latin America represents in green energy. I would share that. There is also, I think, a huge Chinese interest in lithium mines, but the real challenge, and I would hope that Europe could take this on, and Spain in particular, is to invest not just in the traditional extractive industries that have characterized Latin American economies for so long, but look for the value-added ways to go up the chain in lithium batteries, electric vehicle production, for internal markets, and even for export back to Europe. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Let's stick with the study that was published, and you said that you wanted to talk about organized crime. What can you say that has not already been said?
No, one important thing about narco trafficking and violence is that we could see the internalization, the regionalization of the problem. In fact, narco trafficking is today the only case of success in the integration, in the regional integration process. The other case of success happened in the 70s with the Condor operation. Well, it's true. It's true. The secret services of the...
What was the Condor operation for those?
Was the coordination of the dictatorships of South America to repress political oppositors to the regimes. And they kill a lot, disappear a lot, tortures, etc., etc. So we could see today Mexican cartels operating in Ecuador and elsewhere, Colombian and Brazilian cartels in Paraguay and elsewhere, the Venezuelan Tren de Aragua in Chile, for example, and in other countries. And at the same time, the governments are fighting wars by itself without any coordination. And that's a big, big problem if we want to overcome in this issue.
So you said things that had not been said yet. Let's go back now to the question. Why should Latin America matter more? And implicit there is the notion that it's the United States that ought to be paying more attention to what's happening in the backyard of the United States, and the connection through drugs and migration also makes it very important. 30 years ago, Abraham Lowenthal published an article that asked itself why Latin America is not taken seriously more, or something like that. A title that was equivalent to that 30 years ago. Since then, every year, somebody writes something explaining that the United States, in the interests of the United States, was paying attention to Latin America. And everybody agrees. But this is a good example in which the obvious is impossible. Everybody agrees, but doing something about it is very, very hard. I once asked that question. I was also part of those who thought that the United States ought to place more attention. And I asked a person in the government at the time, and his answer was the problem with that, and not Latin America not appearing in our screens, is that Latin America is not competitive even as a threat. It doesn't have nuclear weapons. It doesn't have religious wars. It doesn't have state-centered terrorism. It doesn't have. It has poverty, but poverty elsewhere is even.
It's enough.
Latin America poverty is there and it's acute, but not as much as in places in Africa and Asia. Inequality, as we already discussed. So there is a long list that explain why the person said when we get to discuss, there are always other priorities of the United States that take over and displace Latin America. The question for you, and directly related to report, is what to do. What do people like us who would like to see Latin America better understood and studied, and what should we do? So, and I will ask you to brief. I will ask the same question to the three of you. Give us some hints, some talking points about what to do in order to make Latin America more visible in a benevolent way.
Let me start saying that one of the goals of our report is not the United States, but Europe. The ambassador said that for Spain, Latin America matter and matter a lot. And that is true. The problem is what happened with the European Union. And one of the goals of our report is to call the attention of the Europeans, from the European governments, the Commission, and so on. So, of course, the United States is part of the equation, but not is the center of the problem. But as years ago, Lenin put the same questions: what to do? For us as social scientists, intellectuals, the first step is to think about the problems, put the light on the real problems. Of course, there are a lot of problems. There are a lot of narratives about what Latin America means. But the question is, and Jose Juan said in his first intervention, we need to put Latin America on the global conversation.
Let's leave it there and go back to that because that needs to be unpacked, because on its own doesn't mean anything. So give us some more meat about what to do concretely.
Okay. I love words. I think language is non-neutral. And how you speak, how you figure out yourself matters a lot in politics. And the conversation in Latin America is always hyperbolic. Always hyperbolic. When you think in Latin America now, today, you think in Milei kissing the Pope. This is not Latin America. It's a part of Latin America, but it's not the real thing when you want to talk about Latin America. You are talking always about revolution in Latin America. It's the pink revolution, the blue revolution, the fascist revolution, the populist revolution. Always it's a revolution. It's not true. It's not true. When you go to the numbers, and you, despite what Cynthia has said about Latinobarometer, when you go and ask Latin Americans where they place themselves in the ideological map, you will see that in the last 50 years, Latin America has moved from 4.3 to 5.1, and it depends on the countries. There is not revolution. There is not change in Latin America that on the left, now on the right. It's not true. Latin Americans are everywhere. Everybody is in the general map. What happens?
What happened is something that Cynthia has said. What has disappeared, that has been the result of this hyperbolic conversation that we have, what has disappeared are the parties. Parties, in a very bad understanding of the Cournot monopoly, have moved to the extremes. And they have a volatility that has not been seen until very recently in the developed world. You see that parties in Latin America are much to the left, much to the right, and in the middle, they have 60% of the population that don't vote them just because they like. They vote against the people who they don't like. And this is the result of democracy in Latin America in the last 30 years. Maybe you say that and say, okay, another singularity of the region. No, it's not true. The singularity now is a global singularity. Now, if you are an American and you are thinking about what is going on in the Republican Party or in the Democratic Party, or what is going on in Europe and what is going to happen in France or in Spain or in Italy or in Germany, you have the same question that the Latin American people, citizens, have been trying to understand and react in the last 30 years. And that is the reason that, in my opinion, Latin Americans have not to talk about themselves. They are the leading indicators of problems that now are global problems. And they know much more about how this party fails, how the breakdown of the party system, how democracy is affected, why you don't can build the welfare state, why you don't can make a fiscal reform or to promote growth or reduce inequality, and they are much more prone to the result of populist policies and the creation of this dual welfare state, which is not friendly with productivity. And what else happened? That this problem of convergence that we have been talking in the previous conversation, or this problem of the dual welfare state and the productivity impact, is happening now in Europe. It's happening in Europe. The gap of GDP per capita against United States in purchasing power parity, constant dollar, whatever you look at that, has increased by 3 since 1980. Now the GDP per capita between the gap between the United States and Europe, it's $20,000. $20,000. And when you go and look to what we are converging Europeans, you get very hard results. Germany, that used to be Illinois, now it's converging to Kansas. France, that used to be Rhode Island, now it's Hawaii. And Spain, that used to be Louisiana, now it's Missouri. And how you can wait and expect that nothing is going to happen when these things happen in economic terms? They are going to happen. And Latin Americans have the expertise, the knowledge, and have made a much better conversation on these issues than just talking about what is going on between Milei and the Pope.
That was great. Cindy.
Start with the positive example, which is that I truly believe, and I think that there are facts to support it, that without the involvement of the US government from the most senior level on down, Bernardo Arévalo would not have been inaugurated president in Guatemala. So, in a case as extreme as, corrupt elites trying to prevent someone overwhelmingly elected democratically from taking power, I think the United States will step in. So I think that there is, some glimmer. But I would say in answer to your question, the United States is not unlike what's going on around the world. And in fact, is the, stellar example of many of the negative tendencies that we see. There is no longer a belief in internationalism. I think in certainly in one of our political parties, but more generally across the American public. There are attacks on globalization and on who has benefited from globalization, just as there are in other places. There is increased trade protection. And I would say that Joe Biden is probably the leader in that right now. He doesn't talk about nearshoring. Other people in the administration talk about nearshoring. He talks about reshoring. And it's in part because he believes, and you can argue, the merits of it, but I think the belief is that unless you are able to attract white working class voters back into the fold of the Democratic Party, democracy in the United States is in grave peril. And I think for that reason, he has focused so heavily on bringing back a prosperous working class and middle class. The last thing I'll say is that if you were sitting in the White House or in the State Department and looking out at the region, you genuinely have to ask yourself, where are my partners? Where are my allies? Who are the ones who speak up for the things that I care about? And I would say that Gabriel Boric in Chile is probably the only one who has roundly and consistently condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, who stands up for human rights and against authoritarianism in the region. Where is Lula and Gustavo Petro in trying to broker democratization in Venezuela, which again, as we were talking about migration, I mean, the constant export, the safety valve that Maduro has to just continue exporting population is a huge benefit to him. And yet other countries in Latin America are not particularly willing to stick their necks out. So I would say that, in really cold terms, and I don't necessarily share this view, but I can put myself in their shoes. You look south and you don't see people who are willing to stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States on a lot of the issues that the US government cares about.
Thank you, Cindy.
Yes, going back to the political feeling of Latin Americans and the inexistence of a pink tide or a conservative tide, what we could see in the last presidential elections in Latin America, excluding, of course, what happened in El Salvador in the last 2 weeks, we could see that in the 17 last presidential elections, in 15, anti-incumbents candidates won. Only in Nicaragua, and all we know what happens in Nicaragua and how they could vote or couldn't vote, and also in Paraguay, with the structures, political structures, the networks of the Colorado Party, was the only 2 cases in the incumbents won the elections. So we could see that the undervote reflected this feeling against rulers, against the not fulfilling the promise that politicians did in the past. And that was the origin of a lot of frustrations of Latin American society.
I want to go from the general perspectives that you have shared with us that are fascinating to some things that are happening in the streets, in the homes, in reality. And I want to do that through a conversation about the provision of public goods and public services. A lot of the politics that are going on in Latin America have more to do with the lack of mediocrity of public services than with great ideological projects. People want water in the shower in the morning, and that ends up, access, reliable, constant access to water, electricity, public health, education, and especially one that has not gotten sufficient attention is transport and transportation. Poor Latin Americans spend half of their lives in very unhealthy transportation. Let's bring that to the fold, to this conversation. And what can be done? Again, this seems to be another of the problems that have obvious replies that are impossible.
Was a private banker before becoming chairman of the Real Instituto Elcano, even to come here. And I worked for Banco Santander in Latin America for many years, 17 years. My conversation with the people in Latin America, in Sao Paulo, in Mexico, in those years from 2003 to 2012, when the increase in the middle class, some people, Ernesto Talvi always joke that I create and identify the rising middle class in Latin America even before the thing happened, because I needed to have a story and a narrative. And finally, the middle class emerged. When they talk to them, more or less, I would like to have more precise statistic, but the conversation was something like that. Okay, here's my house. I open the door of my house. I have a TV, I have a refrigerator. Now I have a banking account. I have more money. Okay, I close the door of my house and I look to my neighborhood. Nothing has happened. The transport is the same, insecurity is the same. Things that are under my responsibility, I did my homework. I improved my life. People, public services that has to be provided by the public sector did not appear. And when the crisis began, people realized that something was wrong, that their success was as complete as they have thought, and they become vulnerable, as Cynthia has said. What has happened? There happened a lot of things. Informality, it's a major explainer of this situation, major explainer. When you have 60% of the population, which is on informal jobs, okay, you don't get revenue from that. Corruption is another problem. Bad design of public policies is another problem. Bad priorities is a problem. But at the end is that, except the case of Brazil and Argentina, in most of Latin America, public revenues out of GDP are 25%, 21%. And when you go to direct taxes and you go to personal taxes, you have 5%, 6%. Remember that we make a wonderful analysis in IDB that just 1% of the total transactions in Latin America were surveyed by the fiscal authorities. Just 1% of the taxpayers have an inspection of the tax authorities. If you don't have money, you are not going to have public goods. Even if you can have money and you cannot have public goods, but this is the second step. But the first step is, if you don't have money, you are not going to have public goods. And to have money, you have to have taxes, and taxes which are accepted by the society and well designed. And this is not the case.
Thank you, Cindy.
On that point, the lack of services, I think, is a fundamental reflection or aspect of inequality as it's experienced by the average citizen. There are enormous gaps between people who can pay for services like education and health and those who depend on the public sector. The quality is just hugely disparate, and that's been pointed out for a long time. Why is that? And I would go back to what Jose Juan has just said. There's kind of this vicious circle between people's unwillingness to pay taxes because they don't feel that their money is being spent well by the state, because state institutions are corrupt. There's too much corruption, and also they're not efficient. So you kind of have to address both the supply and the demand side, I think, in that equation. But there was a IDB report, I think maybe 10 years ago, Santiago, that you were involved in, that showed, the amount of resources that would be made available if tax authorities throughout the region could just crack down on tax evasion. The other big reform that is pending that has always sort of offended me as a U.S. citizen who, pays somewhere upwards of 30% of my income in federal and state taxes is that the number of people who pay personal income taxes in Latin America is minuscule compared to companies or businesses that pay taxes. So there's a lot of room there, I think. In a reform agenda, Colombia has done it somewhat, but there are other things that need to be done.
If you allow me, the fact that most of the income public revenue comes from indirect taxes creates another problem against productivity, because you try to make a progressive indirect taxes, which is something that it doesn't exist in the world, and to try to create progressive TBAs, progressive consumption taxes, exemptions, subsidies, compensate, makes your fiscal system completely inefficient and disruptive. It's really a disaster. Carlos.
That's a drama. No, I want to go back to the public services and the lack of public services. And a good example of what happens in Latin America was the pandemic and the way that the pandemic affected the region. Public health was absolutely inefficient to fight against the pandemic. Latin America was one of the world regions that was more affected by the pandemic in all senses. And going back also to the regional integration process, the pandemic showed how it fails. It was impossible to reach any agreement at the regional level between governments to coordinate policies against the pandemic. In any sense, in the vaccine, in the negotiation with labs, in any sense, it was impossible to coordinate the governments in this way.
If I could extend at the question of the pandemic, I mean, once again, Latin America broke records, with X% of the population, something like 30% of the deaths from COVID, that was related to the miserable quality of public health systems, but it was also related to inequality. I saw an amazing statistic that I regret that I can't recall off the top of my head, that looked in Peru, which was one of the worst countries in terms of the, mortality rates from COVID. The percentage of households that had refrigeration was minuscule. It was like less than 10%, which explains why people can't stay in a lockdown. If you have to go out every day to obtain your food, you're going to be exposed and you're going to continue to circulate the virus. So I think that, if I can pin down that basic statistic, it explains a lot beyond the poor quality of public services.
Your questions. Anyone that has, you go ahead and just tell us who you are. Here, tú, aquí.
Thank you very much. My name is Alberto Marisca, a student for the Master in American Studies. I would like to touch the point. We talk about the crisis of internalization or internationalism. I believe there is instead a crisis of Westernism. Because international communication and globalization is keep going on in the global south. The point is that it's not going north. It's a communication among global south countries. And it's not only an Western hemisphere point. Look at Africa. ECOWAS is an impressive crisis because countries in Africa are starting interacting among each other following other global South partners. So I believe there is a redirection of internationalism in another dimension that is not the Western one. Second point about
Why don't we leave it there and come
okay,
back?
sorry.
First point, Cindy, take it.
Guess I'm not sure I share your characterization of the global South. And I was talking, I don't know if Tony Esteban de Varela is still in the room, who was the head of the IDB trade and integration sector. We worked together on some studies of the Pacific Alliance back in the heyday of the creation of the alliance in a completely different moment. And look at, what it is now. The levels of integration in Latin America are laughable compared to other parts of the world. It's every country for itself. The major export markets, because commodities are still such an important, part of the export matrix of Latin American and Caribbean countries. The markets are in the developed world, or in the United States or Europe or in China, and there's very little trade. Let's just take the countries of the Pacific Alliance, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Peru. The percentage of trade, among those four countries is a joke. And the Chile trades more with Brazil, which is not part of the alliance, than it does with its partners within the alliance. So I guess I'm not sure that I would share a perception. I know that in political terms, there is a great deal of convergence around greater representation in the UN Security Council and global bodies and that kind of thing, but I don't see it so much in economic terms.
One quickly.
Yeah.
Well, question. I think it's a very fair question, and I agree with some of the data, not with all the data. I think that we need to have more data, not just on trade, but also on financial flows and investment flows, loans, and things are not as homogeneous as you have explained. But let me put the question in another way. First, let's come back to my first idea that Latin America is one of the places in where opening up the economy has come hand to hand with a decrease in inequality. I think this is important story. It's more important because it means that if you are, maybe there are policies that has helped to this result, this outcome. But in my view, the question is that opening the economy in Latin America everywhere is not just regional. What has happened is that has introduced competition and has weakened some of the interest group, domestic interest group. And this means maybe this result on inequality terms. That's, I think it's something that is interesting to keep in mind. And when you go and look what is going on in the world, we have made an interesting study in Elcano. What we have seen is that what is on the decline, it's any kind of negotiation or agreement which implies some transfer of sovereignty. But any kind of agreement that can be developed without any transfer of sovereignty, both of the parts of the agreement keep full sovereignty and full control of the way they implement the agreement, are on the rise. And in some way, I will not try to make any correlation, simple correlation, but countries which are very old countries, mature countries, maybe are more ready to give up sovereignty to get a result that countries which needs to keep sovereignty at the center of the policies.
Thank you. The gentleman over there and then here.
Buenas tardes, muchísimas gracias por su discurso. My name is JP Carroll. I'm a senior fellow with the Joseph Rainey Center for Public Policy here in Washington, D.C. My question is, we're having this conversation here in Washington in an election year, no less. Unfortunately, high likelihood politics takes precedence over policy. With that in mind, looking at the year ahead, if you had just 1 minute to speak with a re-elected President Biden or a re-elected President Trump, what would you say to them should be their policy priorities towards Latin America to foment a better, more productive relationship between the United States and the region? Thank you.
That was not in the report. Well, only one. So why don't you go ahead and give it a stop?
Well,
report.
no, I don't think so that we have an only narrative to Biden or to Trump. We need to disaggregate and have one for one and another for the other, because the interest, the goals, the politics from Trump is absolutely different in many ways to the other. For example, for Trump, but I could say a lot of things, but I don't think so that he hear me. For example, in the issue of migrations and the border, the Mexican border, you don't need to build up the wall, but he insists. And for Trump, the fight against Mexican or Central American or Latin Americans or everywhere, migration is a key issue on his narrative. And how to change its mind? It's impossible.
Over there, please, with the white, you.
Hello, thank you for being here. My name is Michelle Mesa. I am a student at the McCourt School of Public Policy here, and I'm Peruvian. And my question is, I heard somebody, one of you saying, well, there is this polarization, ideological polarization, but actually in Peru, there's a very big consensus about just getting in politics to just get the most out of it monetarily. Like they have pretty much built all these alliances with mafias, and right now there is something going on in Peru which my generation has never seen, which is many small businesses have to pay a bribe to just operate due to the mafia. So in a situation where we see the region, we see Ecuador, we see El Salvador, who that pretty much has been able to control it, but in this sort of trend that the region is walking, right? What would be your suggestions? What would be your recommendations to actually reverse that trend in a country like Peru, or just generally any country of the region? Thank you.
Cindy.
I'm not an expert on Peru, so I don't want to put my foot in it, but I would say that Peru represents a pretty extreme case, if not the most extreme case in Latin America, of a notion of desgobierno, of a withering away of governmental authority. This is due not only to the corruption investigations against 5 of the last 6 presidents, the jailing of a number of them, but also what happened under the Castillo government and the ongoing inability of the political system to think about a democratic transition from Castillo. So I don't have any magic solution for how to deal with that situation, except that the fragmentation of the political system and the corruption, and I would agree with you that the number of members of Congress who are questioned for being involved in acts of corruption is very high, that the institutions have very low trust, if any. It's probably one of the worst in the region after Guatemala or El Salvador, Honduras. And I don't know how you begin to rebuild that except by having a kind of electoral outcome that people can believe in. that is not what's taken place since the attempt by Castillo to close Congress.
I could give a recommendation to the Peruvian people. I would say, change your political system. It's an absurdity that the members of the parliament wouldn't be re-elected. And that's the origin of many corruptions of the system. If you are on charge only 4 or 5 years, you have to pay your campaign, and then you want to reimburse your investment, and that's one of the key elements of the problem. It takes a time to form parliamentaries. You need experience, you need knowledge, you need know-how, and doesn't exist.
Over there, please.
Hello, I'm Ellen Silva. The panel was very informative. I would like to make a commentary and then a question. My commentary.
Why don't we stick with the question?
Really brief. I missed the perspective on racial equity when you talked about inequality, because it is deeply rooted in Brazil. That is my place of origin. All the data, all the rates are really different when we see the two populations, Black against white. My question is also from the perspective of Brazil. We have when we talk about democracy, the religion has played a huge role on the polarization. So I would like to hear from you, how do you see this in the region, if this is a common problem or just a Brazil issue? Thank you.
Thank you. Jose Juan.
Right. We are talking not just on racial issues, on racial polarization and inequality, but territorial and racial together, which is maybe is much more informative than just to look at the racial issue, because migration changed the map. And we are really very interested in developing this story about regional inequality, the connection between inequality with migration or non-migration, because we feel that there we are going to have some insights that now we don't have to put numbers. And about the religion, well, Brazil and some of the Central American and the Caribbean countries are very special, very different from what's happening in the other countries. But we are seeing that market shares are changing very quickly in the religious market, and this means power. Power is changing, and power means money, but also means media. And the control of the media and the control of the money has been very important in changing some of the political game in some of the countries. Brazil is I still remember when I'm European. The first time I arrived to Brazil, I saw the first Lula campaign when it was Lula is fé. I couldn't believe that. And not a single left-wing politician in Europe will talk about faith. Lula's fé was a very important asset in Lula, and I couldn't believe that. And this happened 25 years ago. I mean, that has elapsed a long time. But important.
Cindy.
Brazil, but I don't think that there's a country in Latin America or the Caribbean where Afro-descendant and indigenous peoples are at the very bottom of the social pyramid. And that is a factor, along with gender, that I think needs to be addressed transversally by multilateral organizations based in this city, but also throughout society and religious groups. Evangelical Christians have supplanted the role of the Catholic Church, I think, in many countries, and that has been a factor leading to a more conservative
and also the role of the state. The evangelical churches replace the role of the state in many cases.
There is a lot of admiration in some sectors for what is happening in El Salvador. There's also a lot of questions about what's happening in Argentina with Milei. So there are two very different leaders that are pursuing high-risk policies. Which of the two is going to be more successful?
You are just when since Machiavelli, when you are just focused on the outcomes and not in the ways to reach the outcomes, maybe you are going to have short-term good results, but at the end you are going to pay the price of not having institution and not having respect for law. And I think that in both cases,
why will you pay if becoming the norm? Nothing happens.
no, it's not the norm, and it always happens. Not to create and to distract, to destroy institution and rules, to make your government unpredictable, means impact on economy.
You look at Latin America, you look at a bunch of countries on their way to be failed states that are, where accountability doesn't exist, sustainability.
I wouldn't use this very gross language, doesn't exist. No, this is the way that a lot of people likes you think in Latin America. I don't think that the accountability dance, maybe it's not worth accountability, but at the end, when you don't try to build institution, rules, predictability, even if you get the outcome that is a good outcome, you are not going to get the full result of your efforts. I don't think that having a very primitive and maybe not respectful system with human rights to deal with crime, maybe in the short term can have. And I am completely sure that if you are a poor living in one of the poor areas of Central America or the other cities which have a really very, very hard problem of security, Bukele for you, it's a god, because it has put all the bad guys on the good in the right place. Well, maybe, but if you go and you look at what La Nación, the report La Nación ran on Bukele this weekend, you will see which is behind that. And I think this is going to happen. And Milei, of course, the good ideas are maybe good, but you cannot make change in the society without having some degree of convergence and consensus, because the changes are not going to be stable, are going to be reversed. Is what we have been seeing many times in many countries. I think you need to learn from history, and these are mistakes.
Thank you. Questions? There.
We have been for 2 years with Alejandro trying to learn. I'm Argentinian, so this issue of Milei, you made a very pertinent question to the panel, because for us, it's not just that. I remember when I asked Father, what was it, Sarasaga, it's inevitable, and he said, yes, Milei will win. And we were still thinking that a more moderate opposition could have had the lead, and then I said, oh, come on. No, we really want that he fails. This is one more point. It's very important. Wow, that you are there, and they need to be consensus, and they need to succeed. Otherwise, what else?
You have some consensus, you have the omnibus law in the parliament, and once they realize that they have to bargain on the content, they draw the consent, the law from the parliament. Okay,
but the big difference.
You want to win, you don't want to make change. You want the victory, and this is not going to happen. victory is never possible in this democracy.
The big difference between Argentina and El Salvador, and of course, Milei and Bukele, is that in Argentina, institutions are stronger than in El Salvador. In the case, if Milei failed, the vice president go to power, go to office. In the case if Bukele succeed, we will see another Venezuela in Central America, the permanent re-election, and it isn't democracy.
Do you wanted to say something? That you give you the last words?
Okay. Last word about El Salvador. It goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, the primacy that is in the report on the connection between economics and politics. But El Salvador is probably the stellar case illustrating that crime and violence, is the number one issue, and people will put up with a lot in order to be able to live their lives, to be able to walk down the street or have their market stall or go to a park with their kids without paying extortion to gangs. And I completely abhor, the hollowing out of institutional checks and balances that have taken place, but they are likely to persist. The question about whether Bukele will be successful, I think, hinges not in the security sphere, although many people predict that these deals and pacts that he's made with the gangs will eventually fall apart and crime and violence is going to increase again, despite, this huge number of people that are behind bars. But the economy itself will be very difficult for Bukele to reactivate. And there will be no one else to blame except the party that dominates the legislature and that has dominated the presidency now for 2 terms, and that, the seeds of his own destruction are in that concentration of power.
The hallmark of a good conversation is that you don't want it to end, but this has been a great conversation, but we need to end it. Jose Juan Ruiz, Cindy Arnson, and Carlos Malabud have given us a uniquely interesting perspective on Latin America and on the report. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming. And I now yield to my friend.
Following on what Moises said, I think, as great conferences, this one opens up many more avenues for research, many more doubts on which direction this quest for democracy and development is taking the countries in Latin America. And obviously this quest is not a linear one, and we see countries going 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, but hopefully many of them will continue in this process to eventually not reach convergence, because Ernesto will criticize us, but basically reach a good endpoint. So with that, let me thank Moises, Carlos, Cynthia, Jose Juan, Santiago, Marcela, Ernesto, and also, the team at the Georgetown Americas Institute for putting this together, and Aurea Molto at Instituto Elcano in Madrid, who help us along the way to put the program together and to do all the hard work that it's behind the scenes to make this an extremely successful event, and Charles Powell, who also joined us today from Elcano. So with that, and all of you to be with us for the full extent of the conference, and the people watching us online for this very interesting and insightful conference.